This week, we're going to focus on hay budgeting. So I've got this picture here. I wanted to show you all an example of a situation where it might be time to start thinking about feeding some hay. Now, when you look at the image, visually, you can see some green, lush growth, but I see several things in this picture right here that tell me that they've grazed it a little short, and that's some low density patches there by that white cow in the foreground, and a couple behind that kind of smoky colored heifer there in the middle of the picture. It looks like these cattle are grazing this pasture down pretty short, and you can notice that they've intentionally avoided some really green weeds there. I'm not sure exactly what those weeds are, but to me, the first place where we should start talking about hay budgeting is when should we start feeding hay? And I know that a lot of folks like to kind of do things off of the calendar and off of tradition and along those lines, but I'm here to tell you that you're better off in a situation that you allow yourselves to have some flexibility and you are reactive to what pasture conditions look like, and when we get short, we make a move. Why I bring this up is because there's a relationship between forage quantity and intake by beef cattle, and I've got it depicted on this graph here. I think this graph is tremendously important. Across the x-axis, we've got the available forage, and that's pounds of dry matter per acre. And then on the y-axis, we've got, which seems like a little bit abstract, relative intake as a percent of potential. And then two red lines here. And what we're trying to say is that when we've got above 2,000 pounds of dry matter per acre available, forage intake by beef cattle is going to be limited by animal factors, gut fill, satiety, things along those lines. But when we get below that 2,000 pounds per acre, we start to see a decline. Now, the relative rate of decline between 2,000 pounds per acre and 1,000 pounds per acre is relatively modest. In fact, you'll notice that cattle that have access to 1,000 pounds of dry matter per acre will eat about 75% as much as their full-fed cohorts. But it's really important to note when we drop below that 75%, that relative intake falls off a cliff. And so how we relate this back to our fields in Missouri is that an acre inch, so imagine an acre of pasture that has forage an inch high, that each acre inch of tall fescue is somewhere between 300 and 400 pounds of forage dry matter, depending on the quality of the stand. And so if you work that back, essentially 2 inches of forage is going to be, let's say, 800 pounds of dry matter. 4 acre inches of forage is going to be 1,600 pounds of dry matter. As such, what we typically will recommend in extension is that when forage height across your entire pasture gets less than 4 inches, you're going to see a situation where cattle's intake might be limited. And when their intake is limited, we're going to create conditions where body condition score could start to slip pretty quickly. In fact, I've got some concerns right now based on the report from Pat Gannan and just seeing the drought conditions that are developing and knowing what our colleagues over in Kansas have been talking about in terms of drought-like conditions on the east side of Kansas. We've got some concerns that we might be having some drought-like conditions in pastures. We might be starting to see some cattle that would starting to slip body condition score. I'm particularly concerned about any spring calving cow herds out in that area of the state. It's concerning and certainly something we need to think about for future town halls in terms of drought planning, for lack of a better way of saying it. Let's kind of go back to our original stated purpose and get into the budgeting hay for cows. Now, when I do budgets like this, we're trying to do projections in the future. And so I'm always going to be a bit conservative in terms of making these estimates. So understand that these numbers have some slack built into them, for lack of a better way of saying it. I see a lot of big cows as I drive across the state and really across the country in this day and age. And so I'll start off budgeting for a 1,400 pound cow, just so that I know if anything, I'm a little on the high side. Now, a 1,400 pound cow is probably going to eat about 1,260 pounds of hay per cow per month. And how I got to that number was essentially that's 42 pounds of hay per cow per day. That's about 38 pounds of dry matter and 4 pounds of water, about 2.7% of body weight. Most people will say somewhere between 2.5 and 2.9% of body weight. I just decided to split it in half. You know, again, we're estimating a little on the high side. Understand that there's a big difference between forage disappearance and actual forage consumption, because certainly when cows are consuming hay, that is never a process without waste. And so depending on how we feed hay to our cattle and what kind of a hay feeding system we have set up, that hay waste number can vary quite a bit. But in this case, I like to use that 2.7 just because my assumption is that the cows are actually going to consume about 2.3% of their body weight per day and waste the other 0.4%, which is about 15% waste of what you've offered them. Now understand that this is not a hard and fast rule. There's two big factors that are going to impact consumption. One, forage quality. If you're feeding fescue stubble hay, expect that number to be lower. If you are feeding lactating cows, their relative intake is going to be higher than a non-lactating cow, so to speak. And so there's a couple of factors that make this a nice rule of thumb to get us in the ballpark, but not necessarily something that we should use as a hard and fast rule in all situations. Now, when we think about estimating our hay budgeting, it's not just the number of bales per cow that we need for a given period of time, say over the winter hay feeding season. You know, I really like to try to get people to think about it more in terms of weight, as you can see from the previous slide. And so a couple of years ago when we were having trouble with the drought, I believe Jim Humphrey put this slide together for me. And this is a table of estimating the weight of various round bales based on their dimensions at different densities, okay? And so the way to read this is 2 columns in the left in yellow are the size of the bale, the height and the width. And then the next 4 columns are the density of the bales. Now you'll notice that the density is in terms of pounds per cubic foot. And I'll give you on the next slide a very simple way of estimating bale density. But you'll notice that we have a very loosely baled 4 foot wide by 5 foot tall bale. You know, might only be 700 pounds of forage dry matter per bale, whereas a very tightly packed 5 by 6 bale can be as high as 1,700 pounds. And so when we're thinking about this, when we're doing our budgeting, we really have to take into consideration, if I were to give you a rule of thumb such as, you know, you need to plan for about a bale a cow a month. If I tell you that and you've got 4 by 5s, we're probably going to be shorting those cows by 35–40%. Whereas if you're feeding 5 by 6 bales, we could be 30% long in that case. So the way to estimate density is essentially based on how tightly the bales were wound. A very loose or spongy bale, imagine a mattress, how a mattress might give. That's going to be a 9 pound per cubic foot bale. Conversely, something that will only deform under the weight of a tractor or a pickup bale bed, something that takes a lot of weight to make any kind of a move in, is going to be a 12. This isn't something that you should spend a lot of time eefing and knifing over. Most bales are probably going to be 10 or 11. 9 and 12 are going to be kind of the extremes. A 9 bale might be one that rather than net wrap, you've used twine. It's pretty loose, it might fall apart. That's going to be pretty extreme. I would tell you that if you estimated a 10 for most bales, you're probably in pretty good shape and should look for a reason to estimate them to be more dense than that. One other important consideration to note is that I've been talking about dry hay, but in recent years, we've seen an uptick in interest in wet wrapping hay or making baleage or grass silage. There's a big difference in those two forage preservation methods, mainly in how much moisture you're wrapping the bales in. When you put dry hay up, your goal is to dry it down to around 10 to 15% moisture. And so 1,000-pound bale is going to have 850 pounds of dry feed and about 150 pounds of water in it, even if it feels dry to the touch. Whereas a wet wrapped bale, it would be relatively uncommon for a wet wrap bale to only be 1,000 pounds. I have a lot more experience with 1,500 and 1,600 pound wet wrap bales. So let's assume that we've got a 1,600 pound wet wrap bale. In that case, if it's 50% moisture and 50% dry matter, that's going to be about 800 pounds of dry feed that you're offering the cows at a time. And so that's a really important factor to consider when you're doing this budgeting. Let's go through a baleage example with a 1,400 pound cow just so you can see how that might impact. Let's pull a couple numbers from previous slides. So we talked about 50% dry matter baleage. That's kind of the ideal. You might see it a little wetter, you might see it a little drier, but 50% is what we target. We're pulling that 38 pounds of intake from 3 slides ago where I was talking about the initial budgeting, where we had 1,260 pounds of dry matter per cow per month. So a 1,600 pound baleage bale, that's 800 pounds water, 800 pounds dry matter. Now you got to factor waste in here. Now, one thing I will notice that I will point out that I've noted a lot, when we feed baleage, it sure seems like the waste is less. It sure seems like they find it to be more palatable. They clean them up a little better. So a 20% waste factor might be a bit high, in that if you need 1,260 pounds per month, and you multiply that by 1.2 to factor in 20% waste, that gets you about 1,500 pounds of dry matter, or nearly 2 baleage bales per cow per month. But understand that that waste factor is going to be an important consideration in this calculation. The other thing that's going to be extremely critical is the dry matter of the forage. We've seen baleage that's 35 to 40% dry matter, or 60 to 65% moisture. And I've also seen it on the flip side where we're above 60% dry matter. I highly encourage y'all to work with Extension, to work with somebody to help you get the dry matter of that forage figured out before you start feeding it, so that you can be reasonably accurate at least. So some final thoughts. I think it's great that we're having this conversation about hay budgeting now while we've still got time to take inventory and to plan. One of the things that we can do to help reduce our burden or our need for hay in the wintertime is to reset our pastures coming up now here in August, and maybe put some fertilizer down at a very modest rate so that we don't have any problems with ergot-like alkaloids come up in that fall regrowth. I believe the recommendation that the University of Missouri uses currently is around 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That nitrogen fertilizer gives you a boost. It gives you high quality forage. And, especially I think is important for those fall calving cows. The scenario that kind of scares me to death a little bit is we have cow herds in the state are increasingly moving towards fall calving. And we have put up some pretty poor hay this year. If we expect our fall calving cow herds to survive for 90 plus days in the winter on some 50 TDN hay or something like that, that's really going to cut into our body condition score without some additional supplementation. I tried to budget very conservatively here. I used a big cow, and I made some large estimates of waste. And when it all comes down to it, if you think you're going to feed hay for 90 days, it's probably good to plan for 120. Make sure you have some kind of a reserve just in case, because you never know when these drought-like conditions or something's going to pop up. Something that people told me when I first moved to Missouri that I was very skeptical of, coming from the West, was that we're always about 10 days away from a drought here in Missouri. After 3 years, I kind of see where everybody's coming from now.